Christmas night should have been filled with warmth, the smell of roasted turkey, and the sound of laughter echoing through the house. But for Robert Wilson, it became a night he would never forget, a night when his own flesh and blood turned. Against him, at the head of the long oak table, his son David stood with a wineglass raised high, his voice cutting through the chatter of family. "Daddy," announced coldly, "you're no longer part of this family. It's time you leave this house." Gasps swept across the room, forks clattered to plates, and all eyes turned to Robert. Beside David sat his wife Samantha, her lips curled into a smug smile as though the betrayal had been rehearsed. For years, Robert had sacrificed everything to give his son a future, selling his beloved Chevy to pay tuition, working double shifts on construction sites, and carrying the weight of the family after the death of his wife Linda. But none of that mattered now. In one cruel moment, the man he had raised and the woman who married him had stripped him of his place at the very table he built. Yet Robert did not shout, he did not beg. Instead, he offered David a small folder, a parting gift, he called it. What lay inside would change the course of the evening and prove that this father was far from defeated. The silence around the Christmas table hung heavy, broken only by the sound of Robert's heart pounding in his chest. His son David, red-faced and restless, set down his glass and pushed a thick packet of papers across the table. "Dad, we're trying to move forward. This house is falling apart. Can't keep living like it's the 1980s. We need new floors, new furniture, a fresh start. You've got money sitting in savings. What good is it doing you now? You're not getting any younger." Robert lifted his eyes slowly, studying his son. Across the table, Samantha's phone glowed with glossy photos of leather sofas and marble countertops. She didn't even bother to hide it. To her, Robert's home wasn't a place of memories. It was a prize waiting to be claimed. He ran his hand along a scratch in the oak table, a scar left decades ago when David, just a boy, carved his initials into the wood with a butter knife. Back then, he'd been proud to leave his mark, proud to belong. Now that same boy was demanding his father step aside, casting him out like an old piece of furniture. Robert steadied his voice. "I paid off this mortgage before you were born. Son, this house has stood longer than your marriage, longer than most of your plans. Tell me the truth, what is this really about?" Samantha leaned forward, her smile as sharp as broken glass. "It's about progress, Robert. You wouldn't understand. The world has moved on." The words cut deep. Robert's mind drifted too. His late wife Linda, he could almost hear her voice in the kitchen, humming as she basted the Christmas turkey. Every corner of this house carried her fingerprints. The rug in the living room, the wallpaper and the hallway choices they had made together. To tear it all out wasn't progress, was erasure. David's frustration boiled over, slammed a spoon against the table, rattling the china. "You think you're some kind of saint because you worked hard and saved money? You're selfish, Dad. Always were. You're holding us back." The guests froze, caught between embarrassment and disbelief. Samantha's eyes glimmered with satisfaction, like this was the outburst she had been waiting for. Robert felt his grip tighten on the silver fork in his hand. He could have shouted back, listing every sacrifice, the overtime shifts, the car he sold, the years he carried this family on his shoulders. He could have reminded David who bought his first car, who paid his tuition, who kept a roof over his head. But Robert knew none of that would matter. His son's heart was elsewhere, twisted by greed, poisoned by pride. Instead, Robert let the word selfish hang in the air. He repeated it, soft but steady, and then slowly set down his fork. Rising from his chair, he looked at David, then at Samantha, his voice calm, though fire burned in his chest. "I see. You've made yourselves clear." He turned toward hallway, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. Behind him, David sneered, "That's it? You're just going to sulk away?" But Robert didn't respond. He reached the old front door, its chipped paint reminding him of summers past, when Linda stood there welcoming family inside with warmth and grace. Tonight it stood as a barrier, as a threshold between the man he had been and the man he was about to become. As the door clicked shut, muffling the sound of whispers and laughter behind him, Robert felt the first surge of clarity. For decades, he had been the provider, the caretaker, the forgiving father. But tonight had revealed the truth. His sacrifices were seen as weakness. His generosity mistaken for obligation. In that cold, dim hallway, Robert made a silent vow. They thought they had broken him. They thought they could push him out and strip away everything he built. But they were wrong. He would not be erased. Not from his home. Not from his life. Upstairs, framed photographs lined the hallway walls. Linda's soft smile. David's gap-toothed grin at 6 years old. The young family they once were. Robert paused, his hand brushing against the glass. That little boy was gone. Replaced by a man blinded by greed. Samantha's ambition had sharpened the edges. The truth was clear. David had chosen this path himself. Robert entered his bedroom, sat heavily on the worn mattress. He opened the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out an old leather-bound photo album. As he turned the pages, memories flooded back David's football games. Graduation day. Moments Robert had worked double shifts to afford. He saw receipts. Tucked between the pages, yellowed with age, tuition payments, medical bills, proof of sacrifices no one cared to remember. He closed the album with trembling hands. His gaze fell on a photo of Linda, her kind eyes seeming to hold him steady even now. He whispered to the empty room, "I gave him everything, Linda, everything, and it wasn't enough." Snow fell outside the window, blanketing the street in white. Robert's reflection stared back at him in the glass-gray hair. Tired eyes, but a jaw set with resolve. He had been the foundation of their lives for too long. If David and Samantha wanted a war, then Robert would show them what true strength looked like. This Christmas betrayal was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new one. Robert sat alone in his bedroom. The voices from the dining room muffled by the heavy oak door. The warmth of the Christmas meal had long vanished, replaced by a chill that seemed to seep through the walls. He reached for the photo album resting on the nightstand, its leather worn smooth from years of use. As he opened it, memories spilled out like ghosts. There was David at 10 years old, holding a football almost too big for his hands. Robert remembered the pride in his son's eyes when he made the team, and how he himself had worked overtime to buy the gear. Turning the page, Robert saw the day of high school graduation, David grinning in a cap and gown. While Robert's back ached from double shifts on construction sites to cover tuition, he had even sold his old Chevy pickup, a truck he loved, so David could apply to college without debt hanging over his shoulders. Back then, Robert believed every sacrifice was worth it. His wife, Linda, had held his hand at the kitchen table when he came home late, her smile saying what words never could, "You're doing this for him." For us, together they had built a life full of dreams, believing their son would carry the torch forward. But the reality sitting at that dinner table tonight was far from those dreams. David had never once said thank you. Not for the long nights Robert spent away from home, not for the money saved, the bills paid, or the house built with his own hands. Instead, David stood in front of relatives and declared his father a burden. Unworthy of the family he had sacrificed everything to protect. Robert's fingers trembled as he closed the album, his thumb brushing against the frame of Linda's photo. Her warm eyes seemed to watch him still, steadying him even in her absence. "I gave him everything, Linda," Robert whispered, his voice breaking in the stillness, and it wasn't enough. The room was quiet, but Robert's mind wasn't. The word selfish replayed over and over, like an echo he couldn't escape. Selfish. He thought of the years he had skipped vacations so David could attend summer camps. The nights he came home covered in dust and sweat while David studied, under a roof that Robert had kept over his head. The years of paying off medical bills when Linda's illness drained their savings. If that was selfishness, then what did sacrifice mean? His gaze drifted toward the window, where snowflakes swirled under the glow of the streetlight. He saw his own reflection in the glass-gray hair, lined face, tired eyes. But beneath the fatigue, there was something else. Resolve. He had played the role of provider, protector, and forgiving father for decades. But tonight showed him that his kindness had been mistaken for weakness. His sacrifices had become invisible. Robert rose from the bed and crossed to the closet. On the top shelf sat a small metal lockbox. Inside, neatly filed in envelopes, were receipts, tuition stubs, bank transfers, all the proof of the years he had carried his son. He pulled one envelope out, a tuition payment of $12,000 dated nearly 20 years earlier. He remembered draining his savings for it, convincing himself it was an investment in the future. Now, looking at the faded paper, he wondered whose future it had truly secured. Asterisk. As he placed the envelope on the desk, a new thought took root. If David and Samantha wanted to accuse him of selfishness, if they wanted to erase him from his own home, then perhaps it was time to stop defending himself with words. Words had lost their power. What mattered now was action-solid, undeniable proof of who he was and what he had built. Robert began gathering documents, placing them into a folder just as carefully as he once drew up blueprints during his engineering days. The foundation of his life had been built with precision, and now he would use that same precision to dismantle the lies surrounding him. He sat back, the folder growing heavier in his hands with each new paper he added. His chest tightened, not with despair, but with determination. His son might have forgotten every sacrifice, but Robert hadn't. And when the time came, he would remind everyone, David, Samantha, the entire family, exactly who had built the life they so casually wanted to take. Snow fell heavier outside, blanketing the city in silence. Robert pressed his palm to the cold glass one last time, feeling the bite of winter through it. They think they can push me aside, he thought, but they've underestimated the man who built this house brick by brick. They've forgotten whose name is on the deed, whose sweat soaked its foundation. They've mistaken patience for surrender. That ends now. In that moment, Robert was no longer a father, begging for gratitude. He was a man reclaiming his dignity. And he knew the fight had only just begun. Robert sat at his desk long after the rest of the house had gone silent. The folder of receipts, statements, and memories lay in front of him like a silent witness to decades of sacrifice. His heart still carried the sting of his son's words, but the hurt was beginning to harden into something else. Not bitterness, not despair, but resolve. He closed the folder and leaned back in the chair, the springs creaking beneath his weight. The snow outside continued to fall, thick and heavy, coating the neighborhood in a quiet white blanket. Somewhere, inside the house, he could hear David and Samantha moving around, doors shutting, faint laughter drifting through the vents. They believed they had already won. To them, Robert was nothing more than an old man they could shove aside. But they had made a mistake. They had mistaken his silence for surrender. For years, Robert had carried himself as the forgiving father. He had played peacemaker, bending over backward to ensure his son had opportunities he never dreamed of as a boy. But forgiveness had turned into expectation. Sacrifice had been twisted into entitlement. And now, the very people he had given everything to stood ready to cut him out of his own life. Robert stood and crossed the room to the dresser. On top sat a photo of his late wife, Linda, smiling on their 25th wedding anniversary. Her curls framed her face. Her hand looped through his arm. He lifted the frame, holding it close. "I can't let them erase us, Linda," he whispered. "I won't let them tear apart what we built." The anger he had buried for years now surfaced, not in wild fury, but in sharp clarity. He remembered the fork he'd gripped earlier at the dinner table, its weight grounding him while his son hurled accusations. That fork had been a symbol of how close he came to letting rage boil over. But tonight, as he looked at Linda's picture, he knew brute anger wouldn't save him. Strategy would. He slipped on his coat and stepped outside. The night air bit into his skin, his breath clouding as he walked down the snowy street. The familiar crunch of boots on frozen ground steadied him. A block away stood an old neighborhood bar, the Copper Lantern, where he had once gone with colleagues after long shifts. Its dim light still flickered in the window. Inside, the scent of whiskey and worn leather wrapped around him. Robert slid into a booth, his hand still trembling slightly as he clasped a glass of bourbon. Across from him sat Frank Miller, his oldest friend, a retired lawyer with a sharp tongue and a sharper memory. Robert told him everything. The dinner, the accusations, Samantha's smirk, David's demand for money. He explained how they'd changed the locks, how rumors were already spreading through the family about him being unstable. Frank listened without interrupting, his face darkening with every detail. Finally, he set his beer down with a thud. "They're vultures," Robert, Frank said, his voice rough but steady. "They think they can circle and peck you apart because you're older now. You're going to let them." Robert swirled the bourbon in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. His voice came low, but firm. "No, I'm done letting them." A slow grin spread across Frank's face. "Good, then hit them where it hurts. Not with fists. Not with shouting. With the law. With proof. You've got the receipts, you've got the history. Now use it." Robert nodded, his mind already moving, gears turning as though he were back at the drafting table in his engineering days. He had built blueprints that outlasted storms. Now he would draw up the plan for his son's downfall. Brick by brick. Paper by paper. As they finished their drinks, Robert felt a new energy coursing through him. He was no longer the broken father sitting at a Christmas table begging for respect. He was a man preparing to defend what was his, using every tool, every document, every ounce of knowledge he possessed. When he stepped back into the night, the snow had thickened, blanketing the streets and muting the world in silence. Robert pulled his coat tighter, his footsteps steady. He thought of David's smug face, Samantha's thin smile, the way they believed he was finished. "They were wrong, they've made their choice," Robert muttered into the cold air. "Now I'll make mine." And in that moment, he understood. He was no longer a father pleading for gratitude. He was a man ready to fight, and he wouldn't stop until his dignity and Linda's memory were protected. The storm outside mirrored the one building inside him, and soon his son and daughter-in-law would learn what it meant to challenge the man who had built the very foundation beneath their feet. Back at the house, the night pressed down heavy, the kind of silence that carries both danger and opportunity. Robert slipped off his snow-dusted coat, set his briefcase on the dining table, and turned on the small lamp that Linda once used for paying bills. Its golden glow revealed a battlefield of scattered envelopes, receipts, and unopened mail. He sat down slowly, pulling the chair close to the oak table scarred by decades of family dinners. This time, it wasn't food or laughter covering its surface, it was evidence. Evidence of the greed and recklessness that David and Samantha had tried so hard to hide. Robert opened the first envelope, crumpled credit card statement, the numbers. Glared up at him. Thousands spent on designer handbags, overpriced dinners, spa visits, and luxury items. His jaw tightened when he saw Samantha's name attached to half the charges. A single handbag too. $1,000 could have covered the heating bill twice over. He set it aside and opened another. Late car payments under David's name. A gym membership he hadn't used in months. Loans that seemed to multiply with no end in sight. Robert shook his head, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "And yet they call me selfish," he thought. "They mock my old house, my worn furniture, while drowning themselves in debt for things they don't even need." Then came the real shock. A foreclosure notice from the bank. Robert scanned the letter carefully. David and Samantha had bought a small condo the year before, bragging at Thanksgiving that it would make them rich in no time. But now the paper screamed the truth to missed mortgage payments. The threat of repossession looming. Robert leaned back, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. He remembered David bragging about the investment, his chest puffed out with pride, while Samantha showed off Pinterest photos of high-rise apartments. They hadn't mentioned the debt, they hadn't mentioned the missed payments. They certainly hadn't mentioned that the condo could soon slip from their grasp. Reaching for his notebook, Robert began to write. His pen scratched across the page, neat and precise, like the blueprints he used to draft in his engineering days. At the top of the page he wrote one word, accounts, underneath. He listed every detail. $12,000 in credit card debt too. Missed condo mortgage payments, late car payments $2,000. Luxury handbag gym membership, unpaid gym line was another crack in the foundation of the life David and Samantha had built. Each number was a nail for the coffin of their lies. Robert paused, his hand tightening around the pen. He wasn't just documenting debt, he was gathering ammunition. Proof that their accusations of selfishness were hollow, that the real instability lay in their reckless spending and careless pride. The old house creaked as the wind. It's pushed against the siding, but Robert knew every groan, every sound. This was his fortress, and unlike his son and daughter-in-law, he didn't squander what he had built. Flicked off the lamp for a moment, staring into the dark kitchen. For years, this space had been filled with Linda's laughter, David's chatter, the smell of pies cooling on the counter. Now, it was a war room. Turning the light back on, Robert tucked the foreclosure notice into his folder, careful not to crinkle it. That document was dynamite, and he planned to use it. A sudden noise snapped him to attention. Footsteps creaked. Along the upstairs hallway, he froze, listening. The steady rhythm of David's heavy steps descended halfway down the stairs before pausing. "Dad?" David's voice came, groggy but edged with suspicion. "What are you doing down there?" Robert didn't move, didn't answer. He slid the papers back into their pile, shut his notebook, and flicked off the lamp. In the darkness, he stood quietly, every sense sharp. After a long silence, the footsteps retreated, and the house fell, quiet again. Robert exhaled slowly, his breath steady. His son had no idea. No idea that his carelessness, his arrogance, had just handed Robert the very weapon he needed. He touched the folder, its edges crisp beneath his fingers. Inside lay not just bills and receipts, but a roadmap. A plan. Evidence to show the truth. When the time came, Robert straightened his shoulders and whispered into the stillness, "You thought you could break me. You thought you could erase me, but you just gave me everything I need?" Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the neighborhood in silence. Robert closed the folder and slipped it beneath his arm. The storm inside his house had only just begun, and he was ready to fight it not with rage, but with proof, with strategy, and with the patience of a man who knew how to build something meant to last. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about showing David and Samantha that the foundation of their lives was built on lies, and Robert was prepared to bring it all crashing down. The next evening, Robert found himself standing outside a familiar place, the Copper Lantern, an old neighborhood bar tucked on the corner of a quiet Chicago street. Its sign flickered in the cold winter air, and the faint sound of laughter drifted out each time the heavy door swung open. For years, Robert and his colleagues had gathered there after long shifts, nursing beers while swapping stories about blueprints and construction sites. Now it felt less like a hangout and more like a refuge. He pushed open the door, and the warmth of the room washed over him. The scent of whiskey and fried food lingered in the air, and the low hum of conversation wrapped around him. Robert's eyes scanned the room until they landed on a familiar figure in the back booth. Frank Miller sat with a half-empty beer in front of him, his gray sweater frayed at the sleeves, his glasses slipping down his nose. Frank had been Robert's closest friend since their younger days at the firm, where Robert had drawn up blueprints. Frank had handled contracts. Together, they'd built projects that still stood across the city. But retirement hadn't softened Frank's edges. If anything, it had sharpened them. Robert slid into the booth across from him. "Thanks for meeting me, Frank," he said quietly. Frank studied him for a moment, his brow furrowed. "You look like hell, Robert. What's going on?" Robert told him everything. The Christmas dinner, David's cruel words, Samantha's smug smile, the accusations of selfishness, and finally, the folder of evidence he had uncovered: the debts. The foreclosure notice, the careless spending that painted a very different picture of the people who had tried to call him unfit. Frank listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with every detail. When Robert finally finished, Frank leaned back in the booth, his beer untouched. "They're vultures," he said bluntly, "picking at you because they think you're old and weak. And you're just sitting here letting them?" Robert shook his head. "No, not anymore. That's why I came to you. I want to fight back, but I need to do it the right way." A slow smile tugged at the corner of Frank's mouth. Good, that's what I wanted to hear. You don't fight fire with fire, Robert. You fight it with proof. With paper, with the law. Robert leaned in, his hands clasped around the glass of bourbon he had ordered. I've got plenty of paper, he said. Statements, notices, even recordings. But I don't want to make a mistake. Frank chuckled, the sound low and gravelly. You're talking to the guy who double-checked every contract you ever signed. Believe me, we'll make sure there are no mistakes. He took a sip of his beer, then set it down with a thud. Here's what you do. Freeze anything they've still got access to. Bank accounts, joint credit lines, cut them off at the source. Next, secure the house legally. A trust would work if your name is the only one on it they can't touch. No matter what lies they spread. Robert listened carefully, his mind already turning. It felt familiar, almost comforting, like drawing up blueprints again. Each step methodical, precise, unshakable, and the will. Robert asked quietly. Frank nodded. Rewrite it. If they think they're inheriting this house, let them think. Again, leave it to charity, or a scholarship fund in Linda's name. Something that honors her, not them. That'll cut deep, Robert, but it's clean. No court in the world can undo it. Robert sat back, the bourbon untouched in front of him. His chest felt lighter for the first time in weeks. The anger was still there, but now it had direction. Okay, plan. Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping low. But listen to me. Once you start this, there's no going back. They'll fight dirty, Robert. They'll squirm, they'll lie, they'll smear your name even worse. You have to be ready for that. You can't flinch. Robert met his friend's gaze, his eyes steady. They made their choice. Now I'm making mine. For a moment, Frank said nothing. Then he smiled, a rare, genuine smile. He raised his glass. To justice. Robert lifted his bourbon, the glass cool in his hand. 2 consequences. They clinked their glasses together, the sound sharp and final, like the closing of a door. When Robert left the copper lantern that night, the snow was falling heavier, blanketing the streets in silence. He pulled his coat tighter, his breath clouding in the cold air, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. David and Samantha thought they could erase him. They thought they could strip him of his dignity, his home, his place in the family. But Robert had something they didn't. Decades of experience, a friend who knew the law inside and out, and a plan built brick by brick with the precision of an engineer. As he walked home, the glow of Christmas lights blinked in the distance, their colors muted by the storm. Robert didn't feel broken anymore. He felt prepared. And soon, son and daughter-in-law would learn that the man they tried to cast aside was far from finished. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. Robert moved through his house with a kind of practiced calm, but beneath the surface. His mind was sharper than it had been in years. Thanks to Frank, he had a plan. And now all he needed was the kind of evidence no one could ignore. And then, almost by accident, David and Samantha gave it to him. It was a late Saturday evening, the kind where winter wrapped the neighborhood in silence. The house was dim, except for the glow of the television in the living room. Robert had been heading to the kitchen for a glass of water when he stopped at the doorway. The voices on the other side of the wall weren't casual chatter. They were conspiratorial, hushed but tense. He leaned against the frame, careful too. Stay hidden. David's voice came first, sharp with frustration. Can you believe this? He froze the account, Sam. I went to pay the car loan, and it bounced. The bank says he locked it himself. Robert's pulse quickened. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and with one quick tap, pressed record. Samantha's voice was smooth, almost cold. Then it's time we take it to the next level. He's old, David. People already think he's slipping. We'll just make it official. Tell the family he's unstable, that he can't manage the house anymore. We'll say it's for his own good. Robert gripped the phone tighter. Every word was a nail in the coffin of their scheme. David sighed, pacing. You think they'll believe it? Of course they will, Samantha replied, her nails clicking against her wine glass. We'll talk to a lawyer, set up guardianship. Once that's done, the house is ours. He won't be able to fight it. There was a long silence, broken only by the canned laughter from the TV. Robert held his breath, every sense alert. Could hear the weight of their ambition, in every syllable. They weren't just ungrateful, they were predators. Asterisk David finally muttered, his voice low. He won't go quietly. You know how stubborn he is. Then we make him, Samantha snapped. We'll tell him it's temporary, just to keep him safe. By the time he realizes what happened, it'll be too late. Robert's chest tightened, but not with fear. With certainty. His thumb hovered over the screen as the phone kept recording. Every second capturing the truth. In that moment, he felt a strange calm. For weeks, he had carried the weight of doubt, wondering if anyone would believe his side of the story. But here it was, their greed laid bare, their plans spelled out in their own voices. When Samantha stood and walked toward the window, checking the locks, Robert pulled back into the shadows, silent as the snow falling outside. Leaf slipped down the hallway, the phone still warm in his hand, and closed himself in his room. Only then did he stop the recording. He played it back once, just to be sure. Their voices filled the small space, sharp and damning. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. They thought they were clever, spinning lies to the family, preparing to ambush him. But they had handed him everything he needed. Robert tucked the phone into his pocket and sat down on the edge of the bed. For years he had been the man who gave, who forgave, who bent until there was nothing left to bend. But this recording changed everything. Now he wasn't just a father betrayed. He was a man with proof. He looked at the photo of Linda on the nightstand. Her smile steady and soft even through the glass. "Don't worry, Linda," he whispered. "They won't win. Not this time." Snow outside thickened, the house settling with its familiar creaks and groans. But Robert no longer felt the ache of defeat. He felt something else rising in him, a quiet, unshakable confidence. They had declared war. And with one press of a button, Robert had captured the evidence that would turn the tide. The following week, Robert returned home from running errands. A small bag of groceries tucked under his arm. The winter wind cut through his coat as he climbed the porch steps, grateful to be back inside his warm home. But when he slid his key into the front door lock, something felt wrong. The key refused to turn. He tried again, jiggling it, pressing his shoulder against the doorframe, but the lock wouldn't budge. Robert stepped back, staring at the brass glint of the new deadbolt. His stomach sank. They changed the locks. For a moment, the cold outside was nothing compared to the chill that spread through his chest. This wasn't carelessness or a mistake. It was deliberate. His own son and daughter-in-law had locked him out of the house he built, the house where he had raised his family, the house that still carried Linda's laughter in its walls. He knocked. Once, firm and steady, no answer. The curtains in the living room were drawn tight. He circled to the side, door locked. The back door locked. Every entry sealed against him like he was a stranger trespassing on his own property. Robert pulled out his phone, dialing Frank. When his friend answered, Robert's voice was low but steady. "They've changed the locks, Frank, and I think they're telling people I'm losing my mind." Frank cursed under his breath. "That's bold even for them. Did anyone in the family call you yet?" As if on cue, Robert's phone buzzed. With a new text from his sister-in-law, Margaret. "Henry, are you okay? David says you're not well. He says you've been confused and unstable. Please call me." Robert read the words twice, the betrayal sinking deeper. His son wasn't just trying to cut him out. He was poisoning the family against him. "They're spreading it fast," Robert muttered. "Painting me as senile, unstable. He's trying to make it sound like they're protecting me." Frank's voice hardened, then they've overplayed their hand. Let them lie. We've got the documents, the debts, the recording. Mutt now. Henry, you need to keep calm. Don't give them any excuse to use your temper against you. Every move from here is strategy. Robert ended the call, his breath clouding in the frigid night air. He looked back at the house, at the new lock gleaming under the porch light. It wasn't just a locket, it was a message. You're out. This isn't your home anymore. But they had forgotten one thing. Robert knew this house better than anyone. He had hammered the nails, laid the flooring, painted the walls. Every inch of it carried his mark. They might change the locks, but they couldn't erase the man who built it. He walked down the driveway slowly, snow crunching beneath his boots. A neighbor's Christmas lights blinked cheerfully across the street, their glow mocking the darkness of his own home. For a moment, grief pressed on him like a weight. But grief quickly sharpened into resolve. If David and Samantha wanted a war of lies, Robert would meet them with truth. If they wanted to smear his name, he would answer with proof. They thought isolation would break him, but it only steeled him. That night, he sat in his truck at the curb, the heater humming softly. He scrolled through his phone, replaying the recording he had captured of their scheme. Their voices spilled through the speaker, Samantha suggesting guardianship, David agreeing, both conspiring to strip him of his rights. It was more than enough to counter their smear campaign. It was the ace he needed. Robert leaned back, staring through the windshield at the snow swirling under the streetlights. They had declared him unfit, unstable, unwanted. But the truth was clear. They were the reckless ones, drowning in debt and blinded by greed. And when the time came, he would expose them in front of the very family they were trying to manipulate. For now he let the snow fall, blanketing the street in silence. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new lies to unravel. But tonight, as he sat outside the house, that was still his by every right, Robert made a silent vow. They can change the locks. They can spread their rumors. But I will not be erased. Not by my own son. Not by anyone. Christmas Eve arrived with a brittle tension that seemed to hang in the very air of the Wilson family home. The dining room glowed with the warm light of candles, the scent of roasted turkey and pine needles mingling together. At first glance, it could have been a picture-perfect holiday gathering, relatives seated around the long oak table, china, plates gleaming, glasses filled. But beneath the surface, unease rippled through the room. David stood at the head of the table, his wine glass raised high, his smile polished. Samantha sat beside him, posture straight, eyes glinting with a quiet, practiced triumph. They had invited nearly everyone, cousins, in-laws, even the neighbors. Robert sat near the opposite end, his expression calm, his hands folded in his lap. Beneath his chair, hidden from sight, rested the plain folder he had prepared. David cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "This Christmas is about family, about moving forward, but there's something important we need to discuss." Robert felt his heart steady, not race. He had known. This moment was coming. He had been preparing for it. David's smile hardened as he gestured toward his father. "Dad isn't well. We've all seen it, his confusion, his inability to keep up with the house, his stubbornness. We've voted as a family that it's time he steps aside. For his own good and for ours." A gasp spread across the table. Robert saw his sister-in-law Margaret cover her mouth, while cousin Tom frowned deeply. Murmurs rippled between the guests, their eyes darting between David and Robert. Samantha placed a hand on David's arm, her voice smooth as silk. "We love him, of course, but he can't manage this life anymore. We'll make sure he's cared for. This house, it needs to move forward." Robert rose slowly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. The sound cut through the whispers like a blade. His voice, when he spoke, was calm. "Is that so, David? You've all decided I'm no longer needed?" David smirked, emboldened. "That's right, Dad. You'll thank us later." Robert Bent lifted the folder from beneath his chair and walked the length of the table. He placed it squarely in front of his son. "Then I have a gift for you, David. Open it." The room hushed as David hesitated, then flipped it open. His smirk faltered instantly. The first page stared back at him, a legal eviction notice, bold and unyielding, addressed to both him and Samantha. His hand trembled as he turned the page. Next came the court order freezing the joint accounts he had relied on. Then came the list of debts, credit cards, car loans, and finally, the foreclosure notice for the condo.
"What is this?" David stammered, his face paling. "It's the truth," Robert replied, his voice steady. "The truth you thought you could bury." Samantha
snatched at the folder, her composure cracking. "This is a lie," she snapped, though her voice wavered. She flipped through the pages faster, her hands shaking. Then she froze. One page contained a transcript of their recorded conversation, her own words suggesting guardianship, her voice plotting to force Robert into an apartment. The whispers around the table rose to a murmur. Margaret stood, her eyes wide with anger as she read over Samantha's shoulder. "Is this true?" she demanded. "You tried to steal his house? Spread lies about him?" David's voice cracked as he tried to recover. It's not what it looks like. We were trying to help him." "Help him?" Cousin Tom barked. "By calling him a burden? By planning to kick him out of his own home?" He slammed the transcript back on the table, disgust etched into his face. The room erupted. Relatives who had once been swayed by David's stories now leaned in, their voices sharp with condemnation. Even the neighbors shook their heads, whispering about disgrace. Samantha's mask crumbled, tears streaking her makeup. While David slumped in his chair, clutching the eviction notice in his fist, Robert didn't shout. He didn't need to. He stood tall, hands folded behind his back, watching as their lies unraveled in the light of truth. For years, he had been silent, forgiving, patient. Tonight, he let the evidence speak for him. The oak table that had once held decades of family dinners now carried the wreckage of David and Samantha's ambitions, scattered papers, spilled wine, and the weight of undeniable proof. As the chaos swirled around him, Robert turned and walked toward the doorway. Behind him, voices rose pleading, accusing, apologizing, but he didn't stop. He placed his hand on the old frame of the house he had built and whispered to himself, "They thought they could erase me. Instead, I erased their lies." Candles flickered in the dining room as Robert stepped into the hallway. He didn't need their approval anymore. The truth had spoken, and it was louder than any accusation. The days after that Christmas Eve showdown passed like the slow thaw. After a storm, the papers had been read, the lies exposed, and the damage done. For Robert Wilson, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was cleansing. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of betrayal begin to lift. The decision came quietly, without drama. Robert called his lawyer, John, and set the process in motion. The old house, the home he and Linda had poured their lives into, would be sold. Not to David, not to Samantha, but to a young family with 2 children who had fallen in love with its creaky floors and wide front porch. Robert saw in their eyes the same spark he and Linda once had, back when everything was new and hopeful. Handing them the keys felt less like surrender and more like passing a torch. By spring, Robert was settled in a modest apartment downtown. It wasn't large, but it had a wide window overlooking the Chicago skyline. At night, the city lights flickered like distant stars, and the quiet inside those walls was his own. No tension. No arguments. It's just peace. Boxes still lined the room. But Robert unpacked slowly, on his own terms. On a shelf sat a framed photo of Linda, her smile as warm as ever. And beside it, a drawing David had made when he was 6, a stick figure family with Dad, written in bold letters above Robert's head. Some memories, Robert realized, were worth keeping. Others needed to be put away. One evening, he sat at his desk with a single lamp, casting a soft glow across the paper before him. The pen felt heavy in his hand as he began to write. David. He started, his handwriting steady, though his chest ached. "I've spent years wondering where I went wrong. I gave you everything I could, my time, my dreams, my home, and still it wasn't enough. You chose your path, and I had to choose mine. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I need peace. This is goodbye." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into a plain envelope. He didn't know if David would ever read it, or if it would end up in the trash unopened. But that didn't matter. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't for David. It was for himself. A way to release the final chain that kept him bound to bitterness. Robert stood, pulling on his coat. The envelope crinkled in his pocket as he walked down to the post office. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily through the streetlights, covering the city in a quiet white hush. He dropped the letter into the mailbox and stood there for a moment, his breath curling into the cold air. It was done. Back in his apartment, Robert poured himself a small glass of whiskey and stood by the window. The skyline stretched before him, sharp against the winter night, softened only by the falling snow. He thought of Linda, of the life they had built together, and felt a calm he hadn't known in years. The past was behind him now, scarred but finished. What remained was his. There were still boxes to unpack, memories to sort, and new routines to build. But Robert wasn't afraid of the work he had built once before, and he would build again. Only this time, he would build for himself. As the snow blanketed the city, Robert pressed his palm to the cold glass and whispered, "I'm still here, Linda, still standing, and I'm ready for what comes next." For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man who had lost everything. He felt like a man who had survived on, who still had years left to shape into something new. And in that quiet apartment, with the lights of Chicago glowing beyond his window, Robert Wilson began the first chapter of the rest of his life. Robert's story ended not with shouting, but with silence, the kind of silence that comes when a man finally chooses peace over pain. He had given his son every opportunity in life, only to be cast out of the very home he built. Yet instead of allowing bitterness to consume him, Robert made a choice. He let go. He sold the house to a new family who would fill it with laughter once again. And he walked into a new chapter of his life with nothing but dignity and the lessons of his past. In his quiet apartment, overlooking the Chicago skyline, Robert wrote a final letter to David. He didn't write out of anger or revenge, but out of release. "I forgive you, not because you earned it, but because I need peace." That forgiveness freed him. It gave him the strength to move forward without carrying the weight of betrayal on his shoulders. And that's the lesson for all of us. Sometimes, the greatest act of strength is not holding tighter to the things that broke us, but learning to let go. Forgiveness isn't about excusing the hurts, it's about setting yourself free. If Robert's story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more stories that remind us of the strength we all carry inside.